Uncle Sesame and Hummus present. Ledford presents. It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life begins with an exterior scene of the town of Bedford Falls. And as the camera pans by the houses, you hear the disembodied voices of the inhabitants all praying for this guy named George Bailey and how he's in some sort of trouble. So then that scene cuts to this celestial image of star clusters and planets and stuff. And there's a conversation going on between what looks like two stars. And they're also talking about George Bailey and how he needs help. So they call up this third tiny little star who has a name. His name's Clarence. And I guess Clarence is going to go down and look after George. But the first thing they do is they make him watch George's life up to that point. So the movie cuts into a scene of these boys playing in the snow, and they're riding shovels down a hill. And the littlest kid goes beyond the hill onto the ice of a frozen pond, and it breaks through, and he starts to drown. And an older kid jumps in, drags him out, and saves his life. That is George Bailey. So the rest of the time you learn about George and how he's this good kid, and but he has great ambition, and his biggest goal is to get out of Bedford Falls, which is his hometown. So you get to see different scenes, like when he's working as a soda jerk in the drugstore, and the old druggist gets drunk because he finds out that his son was killed overseas, had the Spanish flu, and so he gets drunk and puts poison in these pills and tells George to go deliver them. George sees that he put the wrong stuff in, and he can't figure out what to do because the old man is so drunk he can't be reasoned with. So he goes to his dad, whose name is Peter Bailey, he owns the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan with his brother, Billy. And at that moment, Peter Bailey's getting chewed out from the richest and meanest man in town, a guy by the name of Potter. Potter's complaining about how the Bailey Building and Loan won't foreclose on their mortgages when the people can't pay. Anyway, he starts to criticize Peter, and George, who's probably about 12, gets up in Potter's face and calls him a mean old man and how his dad's better than him any day. And, Peter pushes him out and says, I'll see you later. So he gets outside and he realizes he didn't ask his dad about the poison pills. So he goes back to the drugstore, and in the meantime, the druggist, who's still drunk, has found out that George did not deliver the pills, and he just starts to beat him mercilessly till his ear starts to bleed. Now, George's ear is a recurring subject throughout the story, because when he saved his kid out of the frozen lake, his kid brother out of the frozen lake, he damaged his ear, got an infection, and lost the hearing in it. So when the old man druggist is beating him up, his ear starts to bleed, and George is crying and saying, "You're hurting my sore ear." And then the old man figures out what he had done, because George tells him, and he tries to reach out and hug him, and George says, "Nah, don't do that. You just beat me up." But they make up, and a little later on, George has graduated high school, and he's getting ready to leave Bedford Falls, which is his greatest ambition. And he goes to pick up some secondhand luggage. It turns out the old druggist bought him the biggest suitcase and put his monogram on it. So, just to illustrate what a guy George is. So as the story unfolds, it seems like whatever George tries to do to get out of Bedford Falls, he has no luck at all. And I won't go into all the details there, but George stays in Bedford Falls and has more or less semi-constant run-ins with Mr. Potter, because when George's daddy has a stroke and dies, Potter tries to get the savings or the building and loan shut down or dissolved. But George gives a big speech in front of all the shareholders, or I guess the board of directors, saying the only reason Potter wants to shut down the building and loan is because it's something he can't get his greedy hands on. So they, as a group, decide to sustain the building and loan, but George has to stay and run it. And George just wants to leave, so that's his conundrum. Well, George does stay, and he ends up marrying Mary Hatch, who was earlier in the film, when the old druggist was beating George about the face and neck. Mary was sitting there watching it from the stool at the lunch counter, and it's quite an engaging scene, because every time the old man hits George, the camera's on this little girl's face, and she just flinches like she's really seeing something terrible happen. Who knows, maybe she was. But anyways, they grow up, and there's another wonderful part where George and Mary first kind of fall in love, but I don't have time to tell that part. You'll have to watch that yourself.
Snack time.
Can you say it a little bit louder?
Snack time! Snack time.
That's good.
They end up getting married, and right as they're getting prepared to leave for their honeymoon, with all this money that they've saved, there's a run on the bank. So apparently there's a crash, and he goes back to the building and loan and finds that his Uncle Billy has locked the door because he had to give the bank all of the cash they had in hand, and all of the shareholders of the savings or the building and loan want to get their money out of it. So George says, open the doors, and he lets everybody in, and he explains to them the situation, and the people are freaking out, and they want their money, and Mary says, how much do you need? And she pulls this big wad out, and they give the money to all the people to get them through the crash. And so George and Mary stay, and they have children, and one thing leads to another, and a world war comes along. Now that's exciting. Second World War comes along. I'm gonna leave that bit in there.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on. Gloria, Gloria.
And Harry Bailey, which is the kid George saved from the sledding incident years before, ends up being a hero and saves all kinds of people's lives and comes back. And it's in all the newspapers. And Uncle Billy, who is somewhere between mentally challenged and drunk. It's never quite clear what Billy's thing is, but he can't remember anything, and he ties little pieces of string around his fingers. Anyways, Billy runs into Potter at the bank, and gets all puffed up and starts to insult Potter and talk about how great Harry Bailey is and the Bailey family. And Billy's there to make a deposit. He's got $8,000. That's like 1945 money. And while he's chewing out Potter, he sticks the wad of cash in the newspaper that he was waving in front of the old man's face and hands it to him, and then goes to make the deposit, and the clerk says, "Where's the money?" And he goes, "I don't know." And he's looking through the garbage and he can't find it anywhere. And Potter, meanwhile, is in his office and sees that he's got the money, but he doesn't say anything because he's mean. So Billy goes back, and George comes into the office and sees Billy rifling through all the waste baskets and says, "What's going on?" And Billy says he's lost the money. And it just so happens the bank examiner's there to check the books. So George and Billy retrace all of his steps, and they can't find that money anywhere. And then George has a breakdown and starts to shake the old man and tell him, well, there's going to be a scandal, and we're going to be arrested, and if somebody's going to jail, it's not going to be me. And he runs out, and poor Billy's crying on his desk. And it's kind of an interesting scene because Billy also has this affinity for wild animals. So there's like a crow in his office, and right as he's crying on his desk, the squirrel runs up on his shoulder and gives him a kiss or something. So the Billy character is interesting, something to think about. So anyway, George goes home, and the family's decorating for Christmas, and he's real, kind of run down and feeling terrible, and the kids are playing piano, and everybody's having a good time, but he starts to kind of lose his composure, and barks at the kids, and Mary says, "What's wrong?" and he won't tell her. And then the phone rings, and it's the teacher of his youngest daughter, Zuzu. And George grabs the phone and chews the lady out on the phone and hangs up. And Mary says, "George, if you're going to torture the children and be a big asshole, you can just leave." So he leaves after he kicks a bunch of stuff in. And first place he goes is to Potter. And he's asked Potter for the money, but Potter is ready for him and tells him he's going to swear a warrant out for his arrest because he's a member of the board of the building and loan, and he's going to see him in jail. So George runs out and goes straight to Martini's bar. Now, Martini is a friend of George. In fact, George is Martini is one of the people of the building and loan built a house for, so they have a very close relationship. And Martini's telling him what's wrong, because he's all drunk and he's got his chin on the bar. And meanwhile, George is praying. He does that classic "Lord, I'm not a praying man" thing, and asks him to see if he can figure something out for him. Oh, I forgot something. When he goes to Potter, he asks Potter for a loan, and Potter says, "You got any collateral?" And George says, "I have a life insurance policy." And Potter goes, "How much equity have you got in it?" And George says something, like $300. And Potter goes, "You know what, George?" He's got this great voice. He goes, "George, you're worth more dead than alive." And that's when he runs out and goes to Martini's bar. So anyway, George is praying that the Lord can help him out. And right when he does that, somebody says his name, and the guy next to him, this big brutish guy next to him, says, "George Bailey," because somebody said George Bailey. And he goes, "Yeah, the bartender says, this is George Bailey." So the guy turns around and punches him right in the mouth and knocks him off the stool. And it turns out that he's the husband of the teacher that George chewed out on the telephone. And George is laying on the ground. He goes, "Well, that's what I get for praying." So he runs out, jumps in his car, speeds off, hits a tree, goes to the bridge that I guess crosses the real Bedford Falls. Just as he's getting ready to jump off, a body comes right by him and jumps in first. So George jumps in the water, saves him, and it's Clarence. Remember Clarence from the beginning? And Clarence tells him everything. He doesn't try to, he's not coy at all. And George says, well, this guy's crazy. So he takes Clarence back to the bar, and they try to get a drink, but things are different because it's like, it's kind of a quiet place before, but they get back and there's smoke and it's full and there's people playing Strad piano. It's quite a scene. The bartender's really mean. Clarence is telling everybody he's an angel, so the bartender throws him out, and George starts to feel a little weird because it was Martini's bar, but now it's called Nilles. So George accuses Clarence of hypnotizing him. So he leaves Clarence, takes off, and runs into town. And when he gets there, Bedford Falls, which was this little bucolic hamlet, has turned into something between Bourbon Street and the Vegas Strip. There's bars and pawn shops and shit. So anyways, George is realizing something very strange is happening. One thing happens after another, and he just gets weirder and weirder. He ends up going to his mother's house, and she's now like a lady that rents rooms, and she throws him out. And then he goes to find out that his brother was killed as a little tiny kid, and because George had never lived to save him, because Clarence has shown up again by this point and told him that. So George really gets into it when he goes back to town looking for Mary. He goes, what happened to Mary? That's his wife. And Clarence says, you're not going to like it. She's become a librarian, which I always thought was kind of funny. But he goes and tries to get Mary to, see who he is, and she just freaks out and runs, and everybody jumps on him, and he punches the cop, Bert the cop, and he runs away, and he ends up on the same bridge, and then he prays again, and he says, please, Lord, let me live. I want my life back. And as soon as he says that, it starts snowing again. Bert the cop shows up. He had punched already, but George says, I'll punch you again, Bert. And Bert says, I've been looking all over for you, George. And George says, you know me, Bert? And he goes, what do you mean I know you? I've known you for 20 years. And George starts to giggle, and he reaches in his pocket for his life insurance, which was gone earlier because he had never lived. And then it's there. And then he reaches in his pocket and sees that Zuzu's pedals are there. And I just remembered, I didn't tell you about Zuzu's pedals, but you'll have to Google that. So he runs back, gets home, and he realizes that Mary's told everybody, and everybody in town has brought every dime they've got. Martini's emptied the jukebox, and even the bank examiner who was trying to throw him in jail ends up putting some money in the basket. And they all start to sing Auld Lang Syne. And just as they're singing the song, a little bell rings on the Christmas tree, and Zuzu, the little girl, says, "Look, Daddy, teacher says when you hear a bell ring, an angel gets his wings." And that's when everybody starts crying, because that's another part I didn't bring up. Clarence, if he did a good job on this assignment, would get his wings and be a first-class angel. So George says, "That's right. Way to go, Clarence, buddy," or something like that. And everybody's singing Auld Lang Syne, and we're all crying because it's a wonderful life. And that's about it. That's how it goes.